Does God predetermine all moral evil? While we as provisionists would say no, leading Calvinistic scholars say yes. For instance, here's Dr. John Piper.
Has God predetermined every tiny detail in the universe, such as dust particles in the air? And then I should add here, including all our besetting sins.
Yes, which means yes. Every horrible thing and every sinful thing is ultimately governed by God. And that's a problem, but the center of the solution to the problem is a choice you have to make about the cross.
Dr. Piper goes on to make his case using Acts chapter 4, verse 27 and 28, which reads, "Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in the city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen." The Calvinistic logic goes like this. If God predetermined even one event for which men are still culpable, then we have no moral ground to object to their claim that God predetermines all things, while still holding mankind justly responsible for their actions. There are two main issues with this logic. One, proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines all evil events that happen. And two, proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motive or desire of all the parties involved in that event. The story of the cross stands out as a unique part of God's good plan to redeem all sin, not as the proof of God being the cause of all sin. Proof that God worked in some way to bring about the redemption of man's sinful actions on Calvary certainly does not prove that God works to bring about the very sin that His Son died to redeem. Scriptures reveal that God temporarily blinded the rebellious Israelites, or, as Scripture says, sent them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, so that they would not recognize their own Messiah. This was to ensure the crucifixion would take place. And who are we to question God's sinless means in doing so? This is exactly what Paul discusses in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, and again in the controversial chapters of 9 through 11. But proof that God worked to bring about the redemption of man's sinful actions on Calvary certainly does not prove that God brought about the very sins that His Son died to redeem. This is a common error of Calvinists. They take unique examples of God working to bring about a good purpose through the already evil intentions of mankind as proof that God, one, sovereignly brought about the very evil intentions themselves, and two, that He sovereignly works in the same way at all times throughout all of history. But the implication is far worse, because if Calvinism is true, then God worked to sovereignly bring about the redemption of a child abuser in virtually the same way that He worked to sovereignly bring about the abuse of that child. This flies in the face of so much of what we read in Scripture about the character and holiness of our God. According to Calvinists, God seems to be sovereignly working so as to redeem His own sovereign workings, i.e., God is sovereignly working to bring about redemption so as to redeem the sins that He sovereignly worked to bring about. Is God merely determining to redeem His own determinations? Of course not. Appealing to God's sovereign work to ensure the redemption of sin so as to prove that God sovereignly works to bring about all the sin that was redeemed is an absurd, self-defeating argument. It would be tantamount to arguing that because the police department set up a sting operation to catch a notorious drug dealer, that the police department is responsible for every single intention and action of that drug dealer at all times. But proof that the police department worked in secretive ways to hide their identities, use evil intentions, and work out circumstances in such a way that the drug dealer would do what they wanted him to do, i.e. sell drugs, at that particular moment in time does not suggest that the police are in any way responsible for all that drug dealer has done or ever will do. We celebrate and reward the actions of this police department because they are working to stop the drug activity, not because they are secretly causing all of it so as to stop some of it. And teaching that God brings about all sin based on how he brought about Calvary is like teaching that the police officer brings about every drug deal based on how he brought about one sting operation. Yes, at times the Scriptures do speak of God hardening men's hearts, blinding them with a spirit of stupor, and delaying their healing by use of parabolic language. And he always does so for a redemptive good. But the reason such passages stand out so distinctively from the rest of Scripture is because of their uniqueness. If God worked in this way in every instance, these texts would make no sense. After all, what is there for God to harden, provoke, or restrain if not the autonomous will of creatures? If everything is under the meticulous control of God's sovereign decree, what is left to permit and or restrain except that which He has already decreed? Is God merely restraining something that He previously determined? For instance, why blind eyes from seeing something they were naturally predetermined not to see? Why put a parabolic blindfold on a corpse-like dead sinner, incapable of seeing spiritual truth? And why would Jesus instruct us to pray for God's will to be done here on earth as it is in heaven, if indeed His will is always done exactly as He decreed in eternity past? We must understand that God, like the police department in the analogy, may be hiding His identity at times and working to use the evil intentions of bad men for a greater good, but that in no way impugns His character by suggesting that He is, quote, the cause of all things that are, end quote. And it certainly does not suggest that every evil desire and intention is brought about to glorify God, as explicitly taught by Calvinism's actual claims. Typically at this point in the discussion, there are two common objections raised by my Calvinistic friends. The first one is the you-too fallacy. This is when one avoids engaging with criticism by turning on the accuser and answering a criticism with another criticism. For instance, a Calvinist may say, "You too have the same problem because you affirm omniscience, and if God knows something is going to happen and does not prevent it, that proves that He brought it about for His own self-glorification." But be aware, I am opposing an actual claim of Calvinism, and Calvinists are attempting to argue that we have the same problem based not on our actual claims, but based on their own philosophical speculation about the infinite nature of divine omniscience. Notice that none of our scholars actually make the claim that omniscience equals foreordination. Therefore, the Calvinistic argument is fallacious because it assumes true the very position we oppose. As explained in more detail in an earlier broadcast, we do not commit the modal fallacy by equating certainty with necessity. God can certainly know the future free choices of creatures without being the one who determines those choices. For instance, we would see a stark contrast between knowing your child is facing a bully and permitting him to go to school anyway, versus the idea of hiring the bully ourselves while pretending we're upset about it when we send our child off to school. If Calvinists are going to oppose our position, they have to deal with the actual claims of our scholars, not their own philosophical conclusions about our beliefs, while avoiding the huge issue their own system creates. The second fallacy that Calvinists often will appeal to is a false dilemma. This is when a Calvinist presents two options when actually more options are available. For example, a Calvinist may suggest, 1, either God purposes or determines/decrees everything, or the only other option is things happen without any purpose and God is just left unaware, wringing His hands like a passive observer. Are these really the only two options? No, of course not. Better options are available for those willing to entertain the idea that God may have a purpose in creating libertarianly free creatures. In his classic book titled Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis presents a much better option.
Christians then believe that an evil power has made himself for the present the prince of this world. And of course that raises problems. Is this state of affairs in accordance with God's will or not? If it is, He is a strange God, you will say. And if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? But anyone who has been in authority knows how a thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not in another. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, I'm not going to go and make you tidy the schoolroom every night. You've got to learn to keep it tidy on your own. Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the grate. That is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy. But, on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. The same thing arises in any regiment or trade union or school. You make a thing voluntary and then half the people do not do it. That is not what you willed, but your will has made it possible. It is probably the same in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata, of creatures that work like machines, would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other, in an ecstasy of love and delight compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that, they must be free. Of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, he thought it worth the risk. Perhaps we feel inclined to disagree with him. But there is a difficulty about disagreeing with God. He is the source from which all your reasoning power comes. You could not be right and he wrong any more than a stream can rise higher than its own source. When you are arguing against him, you are arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It is like cutting off the branch you are sitting on. If God thinks this state of war in the universe a price worth paying for free will, that is, for making a live world in which creatures can do real good or harm and something of real importance can happen, instead of a toy world which only moves when he pulls the strings, then we may take it is worth paying.
A special thanks to C.S. Lewis Doodle on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel to watch more. Remember to like and share this video on social media. And remember, you can subscribe by pressing the icon in the bottom right corner. Please visit us at soteriology101.com. If you can help us to spread the news of God's love and provision for all people, click on the support link in the top right corner. To learn how to get a higher education, click on the Classroom link and learn more about Trinity Seminary.